Yes, this is the seventh good governance webinar that we are hosting, and today we are deeply privileged to have you. The the Administrative Reforms Commission highlighted good governance in 14 chapters in 14 volumes. So we're taking up each subject separately. Disaster management is a separate volume of recommendations in which they have made about 400 pages of recommendations. So Thiru has been the expert on it, so we're truly privileged to have him, given his depth of knowledge, and you are at the forefront of the entire
You lost your voice.
Yes. So we will try to conclude by 1 o'clock. If you permit, 1:15, the minister has asked me to come for a meeting. So we'll conclude at 1 with your permission.
Sure, no problem.
Poonamji, have the presentations sharing been checked? You are able to share the presentation, Thiru, on this? There should not. Is there any problem in sharing? Yes, we can see it. We can see it.
Let me try mine.
Yes, please. Thiru, if you stop sharing, then try it. Yes, we can see this also.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it. And after the webinar session, if you permit us, we will place it on the website of GGG. And copies are circulated to all the governing body and the members of the management committee, which is cabinet secretary and secretaries, all the senior secretaries, home secretary are there on the committee. We have another 3-4 minutes. We will start in 3 minutes. Dr. Poonam, we can commence the session, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you. Namaskar. Good morning. I would like to extend a warm welcome to each and everyone. First of all, I welcome the chairperson of this session, Shri Srinivas, Additional Secretary DAR&PG and National Center for Good Governance, Government of India, and the two lead speakers we have invited, and they are here, the Dr. V. Thiruppugazh, Additional Secretary, National Disaster Management Authority, Government of India, and Shri Pradhan, Director General, National Disaster Response Force, Government of India, all the district collectors from the aspirational district Government of India, all the academicians from the reputed universities and the universities and the institutes, the officers from the DAR&PG, the officers from NDMA and NDRF, and the colleagues from National Center for Good Governance. So as you are aware that the National Center for Good Governance, who are working under aegis of the DAR&PG, and we are organizing a series on the good governance issues. And today we have organized on the subjected on disaster management, risk reductions, and preparedness and response. So first of all, I would like to introduce the two lead speakers who have accepted our invitation for this auspicious session. First of all, I would like to introduce Dr. V. Thiruppugazh. Dr. V. Thiruppugazh is an officer of the Indian Administrative Service of the rank of Additional Secretary to Government of India. After joining the Civil Services Service in 1991, he served in various district assignments before he was posted as Joint Chief Executive Officer of the Gujarat State Disaster Management Authority. In addition to his contribution in Gujarat earthquake reconstruction as Joint CEO, Additional CEO, and CEO of GSDMA. He also served as the Commissioner of Information, Commissioner and Secretary Rural Development Department, Director General of Mahatma Gandhi Labour Institute and Director General of Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management in Government of Gujarat. He also served as Senior Advisor for National Planning Commission Nepal as well as for National Reconstruction Authority Nepal. Currently, he is serving as Additional Secretary, National Disaster Management Authority, India. He received his PhD from the Australian National University. Welcome, sir. And the second leading speaker, I welcome Shri S. N. Pradhan. Shri Pradhan is an officer of the Indian Police Service belonging to 1988 batch, Jharkhand cadre. He is the Director General of National Disaster Response Force. Shri Pradhan has worked as Superintendent of Police in various districts of Bihar before joining as Assistant Director at the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy, Hyderabad, where he trained several batches of IPS officers as Assistant Director as well as Deputy Director. He was awarded the prestigious Shevering Fellowship of the British Council, under which he acquired the degree of Master of Law. He was awarded the President's Medal for Meritorious Service in 2006. In 2008, he was given the Queen's Award for Innovation in Policing by the Government of UK. He was also awarded the President's Police Medal for Distinguished Service 2012. He is the editor of the first ever compendium on good practices in policing in India. He is also the co-author of the checklist for policing investigation officers. While pursuing his abiding interest in cyber security and cyber peace, he holds a diploma in disaster management and is committed to introduce further innovations and best practices into disaster response efforts of NDRF. In recent years, for his numerous innovation in use of IT in policing, he has been recognized as the national level and conferred several prestigious awards. So welcome, sir. And now I would like to request the Additional Secretary of DAR&PG and the Director General of the National Center for Good Governance, Shri V. Srinivas, to give an introductory speech on this auspicious session. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Professor Poonam. Let me extend a warm and hearty welcome to Dr. Thiruppugazh, Additional Secretary, NDMA, one of the true experts on disaster management in India, and Shri S. N. Pradhan, the Director General of NDRF, a man whom we often see every time a crisis erupts in the country at the forefront of the battle. This is NCGG's first Good Governance webinar of 2021, and today's webinar is titled Disaster Management, Risk Reduction and Preparedness and Response. The chairman of NCGG, the cabinet secretary, had directed us to convene a series of knowledge dissemination webinars covering a vast gamut of good governance areas. So we've identified 14 subjects in this direction, and today is the 7th webinar that is being conducted. So the last webinar was on Citizen-Centric Administration, the improving service delivery and use of Aadhaar. So we had Ram Sevak Sharma ji and the chairman of the Right to Services Commission, Sri Swadhin Kshatriya, in the last session. I had served in Rajasthan cadre, where droughts were frequent and famine code was frequently invoked. Almost every alternate year, it was a famine hit year. And implementation of the Desert Development Program and the Drought-Prone Area Development Programs were part of the famine operations in the state. The Disaster Management Act of 2005 represented the seminal national legislation for disaster management in India, providing for a comprehensive legal and institutional framework for crisis management at all levels in the country. The National Disaster Management Authority was constituted by an executive order in 2005. The National Disaster Response Task Force, which is a highly trained quick response agency, was established to respond to the need of search and rescue and to provide on-the-spot life-saving assistance to the victims. Since its establishment, the nation has witnessed the NDRF conduct rescue operations in a number of disasters. Some of those that come immediately to my mind are Chennai floods, Srinagar flood, Wayanad landslide, Cyclone Amphan. Every time the NDRF has stood out at the forefront, putting service above self, and let me salute the force for their services to the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought forth the importance of the Disaster Management Act 2005 as the disaster management committees at national, state and district levels were operationalized. The Disaster Management Act envisages a unified structure of disaster management in the country where the guidelines laid down at the national level are enforced and implemented by the state and district authorities. A professionalization of the disaster management practices was witnessed in implementing the pandemic response. The NCGG has convened a number of high-tech NCGG workshops on good governance practices in a pandemic for international delegates from 46 countries, as also a workshop for 114 aspirational districts on good governance practices in a pandemic. In these workshops, a number of success stories in districts where collectors have put service above self in fighting the pandemic were presented. Early warning systems and preparation of disaster management plans have become part of India's disaster management operations. The nation has developed specialized agencies for coordinating relief, including effective communication and public outreach in a disaster. The ultimate objective of any disaster management is stabilization of the situation, followed by recovery. Today's webinar covers the aspects of risk reduction, emergency response system, recovery and management of specific crisis situations. We have two expert practitioners who have effected paradigm shifts in disaster management to cover both short-term and long-term perspectives, as also being responsible for their enforcement. I look forward to listening to them on a subject of considerable contemporary relevance as the nation battles the COVID-19 epidemic challenge. With these introductory remarks, may I invite Dr. V. Thiruppugazh to kindly deliver his address. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I will start my presentation. Sir, is it visible? Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, we are able to see the presentation.
Okay. Before I discuss disaster risk reduction, a few fundamentals. First thing is, there are no natural disasters. Unless this premise is clearly understood, disaster risk reduction cannot be effective. There is nothing like a natural disaster. We see that media, even government reports, academic papers talking about two types of disasters, natural disasters and man-made disasters. But I categorically say that there is nothing like a natural disaster. There are natural hazards and man-made hazards. But a hazard is converted into a disaster purely through human element, involvement of human beings. The commissions and omissions we do converts a natural hazard into a disaster. This is the first thing we have to understand. Second thing is, I am not going to talk in this presentation about techniques, tools, and technology which is available. I am going to focus on the basic principles. Techniques keep changing. Earlier, for example, to assess a drought situation, scarcity situation, we used to depend simply on crop cutting experiment. But now we are talking about using drones, remote sensing, AI, so many things. But the essence remains the same. If there is no crop, there is going to be scarcity situation. So I will focus more on the principles rather than techniques. The third thing is, I'm not going to talk about what NDMA has done, what projects are going on, what we have done. You can go to our website and see and understand for yourself. I am going to focus here more on why disaster risk reduction is required and how to do it. What is required is not disaster management. So far, we have been talking about disaster management. Disaster management means a reactive approach. After the occurrence of a disaster, you respond. Search and rescue, providing relief, reconstruction and recovery, all this take place after the occurrence of the disaster. But disaster risk reduction happens much before the occurrence of the disaster. Disaster management should be concerned only with the residual risk. The risk which cannot be reduced is the residual risk. So we are going to talk about disaster risk reduction, not about disaster management. if you look at the global scenario as well as national scenario, the number of disasters are increasing for various reasons, particularly hydrometeorological disasters, weather-induced disasters, climatological disasters, extreme weather events, all these are increasing, possibly due to changing climate. And we are also facing new types of disasters, cyber disasters, terrorism, and certain extreme events which were not considered as disasters are now being counted as disasters like heat wave, cold wave, etc. I already told you about this climate change and disaster risk. Changing climate is very much connected with accelerating extreme weather events resulting in disasters, more cyclones, heavy rains, drought situation, floods, urban floods. All these are going to be there in large number in future due to changing climate. And there is another global catastrophe which we would not have heard much about. What is a global catastrophe? A catastrophe which affects the entire world, like this pandemic which we are suffering from now. But here specifically, these global catastrophes may result in food shortage problem. Has it ever happened? Is there a possibility? I will give you an example. In the year 1815, Mount Tambora, a volcano erupted in Indonesia. The ashes were thrown 45 kilometers high up in the atmosphere. The sun was blocked for 1 full year. The entire globe did not have summer. The year 1816 is known as the year without summer. As a result of this blocking of the sun for 1 year, agriculture suffered throughout the world. There was famine in India, there was famine in Europe, there was famine in Ireland, famine in England, and lot of people, large number of people died. The year 1816 is known as a year without summer. So is there a possibility of such global catastrophes happening, resulting in food shortage for the entire globe? There is. Experts say that there is a possibility. Nuclear winter which may come arise out of nuclear wars. The sun may be blocked for 5 years or 10 years. Then what will we eat? A new pathogen. Changing climate can bring in such situations. So these are the extreme situations we have to look at when we talk about disaster risk reduction. And also, deaths and increasing economic losses. We are losing a large number of lives every year in these disasters. But over a period of time, due to our effort, our focus on search and rescue, response, creation of forces like NDRF, we have been able to bring the deaths down in number. But our economic losses are mounting. Economic losses are mounting not only in our country, but throughout the globe, economic losses are mounting. For the simple reason that population is increasing and assets are increasing. Disasters set back the clock by decades or even centuries. 200, 300 years of development can be wiped out by an earthquake in a matter of 15 to 20 seconds. So we have to proactively look at disaster risk reduction going beyond disaster management. Look at this scenario. If you compare deaths and economic loss for 2 decades, the first decade from 1994 to 2004, and the second decade from 2005 to 2014, we lost about 76,444 lives in the first 94 to 2004 decade. But we only lost 23,840 lives in the next decade. Whereas if you compare economic losses, we lost 107 lakh crores in the first 10 decades and 282 lakh crores in the second 10 years. So it is nearly 3 times. So the imperative is that though we have been able to bring down the loss of lives, we have not been able to bring economic losses down. So we have to focus on bringing economic losses down. How do you do it? We need a culture of disaster preparedness. That is essential. Laws, government programs, schemes, national level forces are not sufficient. Disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction should become our way of life. But the issue here is that we are not a risk-sensitive society. Today also we find people not wearing helmets. More than 150,000 people die every year in road accidents, much more than the lives we lose in jail. I request the participants to mute their mic. So we lose 150,000 lives every year in road accidents, but we still hesitate to wear helmets or wear seat belts. So the challenge is we should become a risk-sensitive society. That is important. Disaster management should become everybody's business. We have to first understand the hazard profile of India. India is one of the top 5 countries affected by disasters, particularly climatological disasters. Large number of people are affected every year in floods and other disasters. So we are always among the top 5 countries affected in disasters. 60% of the land mass in India is prone to earthquakes. They are either in zone 5, 4, 3, or 2. 12% of our land is prone to floods. Nearly 40 million hectares of land is prone to floods. Over 6,000 kilometers of our 7,600 kilometer long coastline is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. 68% of our landmass is prone to drought. Our hilly regions are prone to avalanches, landslides, hailstorms, cloudbursts, and glacial lake outburst floods. And we are also prone to CBRN disasters, chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear disasters. What are the causes? We have to understand the causes. One is the number of disasters have increased, deaths and economic losses have increased. One of the reasons is primarily increase or betterment in reporting. Because IT has improved, communication has improved, we are able to get data about even a small disaster which has affected a couple of villages in some remote corner of the country. So due to this improvement in communication and reporting, number of disasters reported has also increased. It is like if you open a new police station in an area, number of FIRs will go up. It doesn't mean that crimes are going up. People are coming forward to file FIRs because there is a facility available. The other important reason is increase in population and assets. In 1920s, we had a population of nearly 30 crore. And you can imagine what would be the proportionate amount of building stock and assets we would have had in that country. Today, we have 140 crore population and our building stock and assets have grown many folds. Every year, housing stock alone grows at the rate of 3% per year, which means in our country, we have added nearly 30% houses when compared with the previous decade. So increase in population and assets increases risk. What is more important than mere increase in population and assets is concentration of people and assets. If you take the example of Delhi, an earthquake before 100 years would have affected about 10 lakh people. Today, the same earthquake would affect 2 crore people. Concentration of assets and people, density of assets and people increases exposure and hence increases risk. Other important factor is unplanned development. Our planning is not risk informed. Our cities grow on their own. We do not take into account the possible risks when we plan the cities. So unplanned development, we have to plan taking into account their existing risk as well as the risk which will be generated due to our planning process, downstream risk, which is not happening. Then another critical factor is regulation and enforcement. If we have regulations, there is a problem with the enforcement. There is a saying that buildings do not kill. Earthquake does not kill, but buildings kill. But I would say that even buildings do not kill, only poorly constructed buildings kill. We have earthquake codes, IS codes, but they are not being followed. Regulation is there. Building bylaws mandate that everybody should follow these building codes when they are building in earthquake-prone areas. But people are not building and there is no enforcement. In rural areas, there is a problem of regulation. There are no building bylaws. So nothing mandates people to build according to the earthquake codes. So there is a problem here. We have no regulation in certain areas, and if we have regulation, there is a problem with the enforcement. And another important cause for disaster risk is economic vulnerability and social vulnerability. Economic vulnerability is a very important factor. All the disasters throughout the globe have established that poor people are more vulnerable to disasters. Economically vulnerable people are more vulnerable to disaster risk. Though poverty cannot be equated with vulnerability, poor people are the people who are the worst affected. If a rich man loses a house in an earthquake, he will be having 5 houses, he would be losing 1. The asset value would be more, but the personal loss suffered by him is something which he can overcome. Whereas if a poor man loses a hut also, he loses 100% of his asset. So the question is how we will reduce economic vulnerability. The other type of vulnerability is social vulnerability. Marginalized communities, castes, single mothers, widows, women, people with disabilities, children, these are the people who are more affected in any disaster. So our social structure also creates vulnerabilities. If you look at the concept of disasters, which has evolved over a period of time, earlier it was thought that disasters are acts of God. So if it is an act of God, if God proposes, what can we do? We cannot do anything. We can't prevent it. We have to be reactive. We have to make an attempt to save lives. But then that notion changed, and the notion of an external agent came into existence. It is not God which is creating the disaster, but is an external agent outside the human society. A geophysical event, a hydrometeorological event, or a biological event is happening which is outside the societal structure. But even that changed. Then we started looking at disasters as social construct. It is caused by the very structure of the society. The cleavages in our society in terms of caste, in terms of class, all this brings about this disaster. Political reasons. People in a democratic country are not affected in the same way as people in a dictatorial regime. Similarly, cultural factors causing disasters. For example, jhum cultivation in certain parts of our country is causing disasters. So disasters are viewed as social constructs, social, economic, political, cultural factors causing disasters. So if we understand that disasters are not created by an external agency, but by the way we develop ourselves, our development process itself is creating the disasters, then we can become proactive rather than reactive. What is disaster risk? Disaster risk is a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and it is inversely proportional to the capacity. Hazard is something, if it is natural, we don't have much control over it. But vulnerability is something we can reduce. We have to reduce the physical vulnerability. We have to reduce the social vulnerability, economic vulnerability. And we have to reduce the exposure. Concentration of people and assets can be reduced if we plan properly and increase the capacity. Our capacity in terms of financial capacity, in terms of technical capacity, managerial capacity, we can improve our capacity. So even if we do not have much control over natural assets, we can reduce the disaster risk. What is risk? Risk involves as an element of uncertainty. If an event is not going to happen, there is no risk. If an event is certainly going to happen, then we say that it is a certainty and there is no risk. Risk means there is a probability. That probability can be reduced if we can reduce vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. As far as man-made hazards are concerned, we can even reduce the hazard aspect of the risk. So how do you do this? There is a wonderful framework for reducing disaster risk given by Sendai Framework. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is a global agreement voluntarily signed by 187 countries in the world in 2015, including India. It gives a very good framework. One is understanding risk. Second is risk governance. Third is investing in risk reduction. And fourth is improving early warning, preparedness, and building back better. These 4 priorities are not sequential. They are all to be carried out concurrently, simultaneously. Understanding risk is essential. Without understanding risk, how will we reduce risk? We should know our hazards, vulnerabilities, exposure, and the gaps in our capacity. Then only we can look at disaster risk reduction. The other aspect is improving risk governance. It's a very good word, risk governance. It is not improving the governmental system alone. It is all of the society approach. So we have to improve risk governance. Third is investing in risk reduction. It is again a very beautiful word. The framework is not saying that we should spend in risk reduction. If you spend, you call it as an expenditure, whereas here it says investing, because any money, any funds we invest in risk reduction actually saves a lot of money in response, recovery, and rescue. The conventional economics says save now and spend later, but disaster economics says that spend now and save later. So we have to spend in risk reduction, and that is an investment. And finally, in order to tackle the residual risk, we should have improved early warning systems, preparedness, and in case if there is a major disaster, we should build back better. Building back better is against building back similar. There is no point in building back with the same vulnerabilities, same risk. So in the aftermath of a major disaster, if we launch a recovery and reconstruction program, we have to see to that the vulnerabilities are reduced, risk reduction takes place, and we launch a sustainable risk reduction program. And how do we do this? First, understanding risk. We need to have hazard risk vulnerability assessments. Assessments at the district level, state level, at the national level. We have to have this hazard risk assessments for each type of hazard, and then they should be superimposed over the other so that we have a composite risk. Unless we know which are the highly risk-prone areas, we cannot prioritize our intervention. I used to say that disaster risk also is like Pareto's principle. 80% of the risk is concentrated in 20% of the places. 80% of the risk in building stock will be concentrated in 20% of the buildings. So we have to have this hazard risk vulnerability assessments. Second is microzonation studies. Microzonation is available. The country is divided into 4 earthquake zones, but that is not going to help us for actually deciding whether we have to locate an industry in a particular place, whether we should carry on with a particular development project in an earthquake-prone area. What we need is microzonation studies. Third is analysis of the losses which we have suffered in the previous disasters will also help us to understand risk. And the fourth point is much more important, risk communication. As far as risk is concerned, we talk about 2 types of risk, objective risk and subjective risk. Objective risk is the way in which experts perceive risk, the way in which scientists will understand risk. You and I will understand risk, but that is not sufficient. The way people understand risk is very different. Unless people are informed about the risk, proactive risk reduction, and having a culture of disaster risk reduction cannot take place. So risk communication is very, very important. The second is risk governance. We should improve our risk governance. First of all, we should have institutions. We do have institutions at the national level, NDMA, NDRF, NIDM. At the state level, SDMAs are there, and SDRFs are there, and DDMAs are there at the district level. But we need institutions at the local level, at the municipal level, at the village level. So institutional mechanism is important. Second is instruments are important. We need legal instruments, policy instruments, plans. Third is we need financial instruments. Financial instruments, one of the most important area is risk transfer and insurance, sharing of risk. In this area, India has to do a lot of work, and we need human resources, not simply educated, but competent, technically competent people are required in the area of human resources, and we need to build capacity. Capacity for search and rescue, capacity for planning, capacity for mitigation. And finally, we need to build the capacity of the communities. That is why we talk about community-based disaster risk reduction. Communities are the first responders in the aftermath of a disaster. That has been very well recognized. But now we also need to recognize communities have to proactively engage themselves in risk reduction. Unless their capacities are built, sustainable risk reduction will not take place. Whenever we are talking about capacity building, we have always been talking about the capacity of the giver, whether government agencies have the capacity to deliver. But we should also build the capacity of the receiver. Otherwise, sustainable risk reduction cannot take place. Finally, investing in resilience. As I said earlier, it is an investment, not an expenditure. First of all, our structures should be resilient to disasters. The buildings we build, the roads, the bridges, our hospitals, our schools, the physical infrastructure should be resilient to disasters. But that everybody will accept. What is more difficult and what is more important is we need to go beyond the structures, and we have to build resilient livelihoods. And we have to look at social security. We said that social vulnerability is one of the reasons for increasing risk. So if you want to reduce social vulnerability, social security should be paid attention. Access to education and health decreases disaster risk. We need human resources, capable, trained resources. And we also need to invest in research which will be useful to the people. And finally, research confined to laboratories and universities is not sufficient. Knowledge generation is not sufficient. Knowledge sharing is also important. We all say that knowledge is power. This saying is famously attributed to Francis Bacon. But actually, this was written down by his secretary who became later a philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. What Hobbes writes is, the end of knowledge is power. He doesn't write knowledge is power. End of knowledge is power when knowledge is translated into action. So knowledge should end, it should become action. If action should take place based on the knowledge generated in research institutions and universities, it should be actively shared. Finally, in order to save lives, in order to prepare people, in order to build back better, we need better early warning and communication systems. India has done a great job in this area. We are able to save the lives of people in cyclones. In super cyclone Orissa in the 90s, we lost more than 10,000 people. In all the recent cyclones, the total deaths did not even cross 100. But still, there is a lot of scope for improving early warning, and last mile connectivity and communication is important. We have to focus on that, and training and capacity building. We need to conduct mock drills. DG NDRF will cover this extensively, I hope. The word drill is a meaningful word. The do's and don'ts during the time of a disaster should become part of our unconscious mind. It should be drilled so that people do not think there is automatic action. And there is need for coordination. Coordination, the very definition of a disaster is that multiple agencies have to come into play in a disaster situation. When multiple agencies come into play, then there is this problem of coordination. This coordination should be improved. If coordination in the aftermath of a disaster has to be improved, then coordination before the disaster has to be improved for a disaster risk reduction. And also there is need for promoting volunteerism. In the aftermath of any disaster, we see a surge of volunteers, and spontaneous volunteerism is there in every part of the country. But many a times, spontaneous volunteerism becomes a hindrance rather than a help. So we need trained, qualified, and certified volunteers. Finally, if there is a major disaster, we have a need to build back better. So with this, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Thiruppugazh. In fact, listening to you, we felt that the nation is really invested in high-end risk governance, as also in developing specialized administrators who can handle disasters. Thank you for such an illuminating presentation. May I now invite Shri S.N. Pradhan, a man whom we have already recognized as the front-end warrior in handling disasters, to kindly make his presentation. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivas. It's a privilege, and I'm very happy to be amongst people who are interested in the aspect of disaster preparedness. Thiru has already covered the aspect of the culture of disaster preparedness and disaster response, or building back better. It's about risk-orientedness and risk, knowledge. So the word culture is something that I'd like to re-emphasize. And as the renowned management guru says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So Edward de Bono said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, because he believed that culture is the basis of any action. And if there is a deep embedded culture of disaster preparedness in a country, one good example is Japan. Much of the problems are resolved because there is an inbuilt instinct for disaster preparedness. And that instinct probably is not a destination that we have achieved in India. I think we are still very disaster unaware, or at least disaster less aware, if that phrase can be used. And in a way, NDRF as a frontline federal responding force is trying to also embed that culture, because without that culture, we would also not be probably as effective as we want to be. So with that introduction, I'd like to share my presentation, and I'll go through that. And when I share my presentation, I hope you can see it now. This is obviously about preparedness and response from an NDRF perspective. I say that very consciously, because I still feel that sometimes the role of NDRF, the perspective of NDRF, and the background knowledge about NDRF and what it does and what is its USP and how is it part of the preparedness grid for the country, is sometimes not very clear in the minds of people who are even the clients or the users. For example, the district magistrates are here, and I believe the aspirational districts are also involved. Coincidentally, I still continue to be a Prabhari officer of one of the aspirational districts in Jharkhand, which is my cadre. And I travel almost every 2 months to the aspirational district, and I do try to engender a culture of disaster preparedness even there. So it is very vital that the perspective of NDRF, but not necessarily the perspective which is confined to NDRF, but the perspective of disaster preparedness is also analyzed and appreciated at the user level. And district magistrates and other senior officers being, and even the ministries being asked to have their own disaster management or disaster preparedness plans, actually probably underlines the reason to understand why we should be prepared and how we should be prepared. Already, Thiru has covered the fact that there is risk governance that has come in terms of institutionalization. And that has happened probably because of a very sharp learning curve of 20 years. I'll just go through that very quickly in the interest of time, because it has been covered partially by Thiru. Those 5 years from 1999 to 2004, where the first 5 years of these 20 years, we have covered a decade since 1999, roughly 21 years since 1999 super cyclone of Odisha, which saw more than 10,000 lives lost, followed exactly 2 years later by the Bhuj earthquake in 2001 on the Republic Day, which Thiru was very, very acutely aware of, where we had more than 13,000 lives lost on record, and many, many persons injured. Then in 2004, the tsunami, which we all remember. Now, these 5 years of the last 2 decades, the first 5 years of the last 2 decades were like a wake-up call for India to set up its risk or disaster governance mechanism. So from a reactive to a reactive and relief-centric approach, we traversed the path and probably were disrupted by these 3 disasters back to back to go into a paradigm shift, to have a holistic, integrated approach with emphasis on prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. that was, I think, the beginning of the recognition for a culture of preparedness in this country to be disaster ready or disaster prepared. NDRF came out as part of that preparedness approach. And under the Disaster Management Act 2005, in the section 44I of the Act, you can just see the words and the underline the wording. NDRF was to be a specialist force, and I underline specialist, a specialist force to respond to disasters or threatening disaster situations. So already when you say threatening disaster-like situations, you are already talking of prevention, mitigation. It's not only disasters to respond to disaster, but threatening disaster situations. So there is a threat every year of floods. And none other than the Honorable Prime Minister this year in 2020, last year rather, held 2 meetings back-to-back about the preparation of floods as chairperson of the National Disaster Management Authority. The preparations about floods with the chief ministers and all the other people, including the NDRF. So when the governance system at the highest level and down to the panchayat level or the local self-government level recognizes disaster as a mainstream governance agenda, that is when an institution or a force like NDRF also succeeds in that context. So it is, I've just written an article saying that the deployment of NDRF to a disaster situation is not the mere deployment or the action of deployment, but it is a culmination of a systemic process where the states take on board that NDRF is required, that we need to respond, that if 7 days in advance in Cyclone Foni or 14 days in advance in the case of Cyclone Foni, the NDRF was already in the potential impact districts across Orissa, 14 days in advance. So that is a testimony to the efficiency of the prediction services in this country, testimony to our reason to be prepared, testimony for a political culture that is developing where the political parties also, I would like to emphasize this very interesting development in this country, that in some states the political parties are actually having in their manifestos their government's record of going for zero casualty in disaster. That's a platform issue. So this is a good sign that disaster response and disaster preparedness is coming slowly but surely into the mainstream, and NDRF and its actions are part of that. It was constituted in 2006, just for a matter of record, with 8 battalions, and we are a fully deputationist force. So we are from the DG downwards to the last constable is on deputation, and they are from the various paramilitary forces up to the DIG, up from the various paramilitary forces. And right now we are 13 battalions strong. And what is the role of NDRF? Either we are acting or we are training. Either we are operating, we are training. That is the USP. I'll come to the exact USPs subsequently. But we are, during the disasters, a specialized response force. Impending disaster situation or normal situations, non-disaster situations, we are proactively deployed, redeployed, or while in a non-disaster period, we are acquiring new skills, upgrading existing ones, continuously training ourselves, and also the state disaster response forces, the police, the civil defense, the home guards, the civil administration, assisting the community in its capacity development, and doing liaising, recce, and vulnerability mapping, etc. So it is not that NDRF is just there to respond in the first hour of or during the disaster when it happens. It is part of a critical process of developing a culture of disaster response or disaster preparedness. I repeat that ad nauseam. The composition, just for information, because I think it is important to understand what is the composition of. Right now we have 12 battalions. The 13th is already in the process, and this is the spread of the NDRF battalions, as you can see, across the country. It's virtually across the country. Under the battalions, Each battalion has 18 search and rescue teams. And under the battalions, there are regional response centers. There are 28 on record, but there are informal response centers across the country, almost 40 total. So as you can see, NDRF has a footprint across the country, and there is hardly any state, or probably no state, where NDRF presence is not there. And it is specialist manpower, so medical officers, engineers, paramedics, technicians, electricians, and canine squad is part of it. The USP, it's a main field responder of the Government of India. I say that deliberately because disaster response is a state subject or a district or a local subject. Government of India sends NDRF as a force of assistance. I underline that, force of assistance. So as a force of assistance, it goes as a specialist responder, although in practice that has been to an extent compromised. It's an amalgam of Central Reserved Police Forces from all the CAPFs. It probably is, very interestingly, one of the unique forces, disaster response forces of the world, because in other parts of the world, the disaster response forces are not exclusively disaster response forces. There are fire services who handle disasters. There are police personnel who handle disasters. There are maybe civil defense personnel who handle disasters. In China, for example, there's a big disaster response component, but they are all fire service people. So is in Russia, which is fire service and civil defense. It is only in India that government in its wisdom has set up a exclusively dedicated disaster response oriented force. So it requires to be multi-skilled. So it is not as if that they are only collapse structure experts or flood water experts or CBRN experts. Every disaster responder of the NDRF is multi-skilled. He is also trained in, even if it is medical first response and emergency management, he's trained in that. And there is already a canine squad in every team. Minimal response time, self-contained all-in-one units, and collaborative capacity building along with the states and the community. Just for your information, because this is critical in how you use the NDRF, they are fully trained in collapse structure search and rescue operations, medical first response, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear emergency response, flood disasters, mountain search and rescue, deep diving search and rescue, canine and technical search, and including animal rescue. We have 310 equipment in every team. They are divided into various verticals. I'm not going into the details, but suffice it to say that the best of the technology that is across the world also is converged with the NDRF personnel. And some of the skills that they have is medical first response. Let me share with you that as many as 24 deliveries have taken place on the NDRF boats very safely without any casualties. We do collapse structure and rescue, which is the situation in an earthquake or a building collapse. We do chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear rescue, mountain search and rescue, aquatic disaster response course, and underwater diving. Very specialized skills like heli slithering, avalanche rescue training, incident response training, advanced trauma life saving, advanced trauma care for nurses, disaster psychosocial care and gender sensitization also is very much part of the arsenal of the NDRF personnel. Some major operations, just visuals in the interest of time, just I'll run through recent and past, starting from the recent, the 2020 floods almost across India, all over the country. The Air India plane crash, I'll come back to that briefly during the interaction at Kozhikode. Landslides, just the typology that NDRF has to deal with, just to give a look-see into that. Cyclones, of course, bread and butter work for NDRF. Cyclone Nisarga happened in 2020. Amphan, which was mentioned by Srinivas ji, 2020. The gas leakage, which is a man-made disaster in Visakhapatnam, which could have gone wrong unless handled early, and which was done mercifully and could be handled early. Borewell, smaller incidents like kids trapped in a borewell also take a lot of our effort and time. And that is probably speaks to the local capability. And since states are represented here in this webinar, I would like to implore upon states and the district administration why there is a thought to be given as to why NDRF has to be requisitioned for borewell incidents and also drowning incidents. State capacity and local capacity is an issue that has to be handled as part of the preparedness. Again, cyclones, boat capsize incidents, floods, urban floods, which is a recent phenomenon. A Mahalakshmi Express, which was trapped in flood waters for better part of a day. Building collapses, cyclones, where India earned the praise of the United Nations and also the international media. New York Times went on to say that if you want to learn how to handle a cyclone and save lives, learn it from a poor eastern state in India. So these are probably testimony to the increasing culture of preparedness across the country. Whether it's uniform or not is a question, of course, to be deliberated. But certainly there is a livening up of the disaster response governance, which is happening across the country. Building collapses, borewell incidents. I'll just run through that. Yeah, Kumbh Mela, again, a calendar event where there is congregation, heavy congregation, and disasters could be around the corner. That is where we have started being requisitioned on a regular basis across such in events across the country. Again, this was not the case 5 years ago. So obviously there is a greater awareness and greater sensitivity about the possibility of disasters being prevented. Some international operations also we were part of the Japan triple disaster, which earned us the encomiums from the Honorable Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Nepal earthquake. We do capacity building programs for the community, and what Thiru referred as community being the first responder. We deeply believe in that, and that actually helps us. If there is a responsive and a prepared community, it actually is a force multiplier for the efficiency of NDRF. So we do that, and the number of beneficiaries in the community runs to lakhs. In the last 5 years or so, NDRF has trained more than 60 lakhs of community volunteers. And also included the aspects of using locally available resources, which are common resources like the stems of a banana tree, to make rafts or life-saving equipment, and mock exercises, which Thiru did indicate that is a critical part of preparedness. We do mock exercises, and right now, as we speak, we are conducting mock exercises, or we are implementing a calendar of mock exercises with various stakeholders and institutions in all these 700-odd districts across India. And the mandate given by the Government of India is that there should be at least one mock exercise, mega mock exercise, district-wide, in every 3 years for each district. So that would be about 200-odd districts or 250+ districts every year in the next 3 years. Some visuals of the mock exercises that we do. And the regional cooperation, because one must remember that disasters don't follow borders. So a cyclone that happens in India can impact Bangladesh and can impact Sri Lanka, for example. And unless there is regional cooperation and international cooperation, the culture of disaster governance and disaster risk management will not really seep in deep enough. Some of the numbers of the number of operations conducted by NDRF, just as a input, including capacity building. So just to reiterate the point that it is not for NDRF to be just deputed in a case of a disaster situation that has happened or is about to happen. when we are not operating in a disaster situation, we are actually engendering a culture of disaster preparedness. And these numbers actually show that we are part of that culture of disaster preparedness. So to reiterate what Thiru said, that ultimately the front line of a disaster prepared nation like India would be a prepared local community, which is the disaster facing entity in the government or in the society, followed probably by the state agencies like SDRF and the state disaster response ecosystem. And only then by NDRF, I say NDRF plus because NDRF can be supplemented by the paramilitary, the army, the navy, etc. But ultimately, the prepared local community is the first bulwark of disaster preparedness. When I say there is a holistic approach required for preparedness, this is my summing up slide. We have talked of whole of society approach. It also has to be a whole of governance approach. And as we go into the 21st century, or into 2021, for example, it is very clear that states are now more and more disaster and risk oriented. They have realized that this is a critical part of mainstream governance. So whole of governance approach, when I say vertically and horizontally. All the ministries and deeper down from the federal to the state to the local level, there has to be a whole of governance approach for preparedness. Of course, there is a whole of society approach where the entire society, down to the poorest man to the most well-off entity in the society, has to be disaster aware and risk aware. And internationally speaking of the world as one, it has to be a world as one approach, because ultimately there will be a scenario where multiple countries are affected and the world has to respond as one, as we are responding in the case of COVID, because it's an international pandemic. NDRF in its own way is very much a part of all these approaches and wants to be a part of all these approaches and is primed to be a part of all these approaches. And that is how we are, imbibing a culture which is down to the last constable also. Let me share with you that it must be an interesting and a matter of pride for the country as a whole, that it is possible that in 6 months to 1 year's time, NDRF will be recognized by the United Nations as an international force of assistance. And it will be INSARAG certified, INSARAG being the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group under the UN. So it will have the UN badge, and multiple teams of NDRF would be on standby for any international duty. So the whole world as one approach will be also have a proof of concept in the preparedness of NDRF on behalf of India. So just to sum up, preparedness, when properly pursued, is a way of life. And I underline that aspect, is a way of life, not a sudden spectacular program. And I think NDRF wants to imbibe that culture in itself, in its operations, in its training, in its SOPs, in its protocols, but also wants to horizontally widen and imbibe that culture across society and become a catalyzing agent in this process of preparedness. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We've seen a number of slides with the valor and courage that has been displayed by the NDRF personnel in handling a number of crises in recent years. And let me congratulate you and also acknowledge the quantum of work and perseverance that the force has shown in recent years. I have two questions for you. One for Dr. Thiru. There are a number of collectors who are attending this meeting. And what is your advice to them? We have served as collectors too. And when I served, we used to have these very young volunteers for civil defense. We would also have these home guards who would often be working into other chores. I can see Collector Bara here, Collector Sirohi, a number of collectors are here. What is your advice to them on how to improve risk governance? Kindly unmute yourself. You're
Yes.
muted.
Yes. My first suggestion would be, sir, they should prepare a good, robust district disaster management plan. We are scrutinizing plans from many districts. We find basically most of them are, basically about response. They should talk about prevention, mitigation, clarity of roles and responsibility of all the departments and divisions within the district, and also the financial allocation and mainstreaming with the existing government programs. We cannot ask separate funds for separate activities. Government will not be able to give. All of us know this. In the villages, in the district, there are so many programs going on, particularly from Rural Development Ministry. All this has to be used for a disaster risk reduction. Mainstreaming should be integrated. For that, sir, for preparation of the district disaster management plan, they should look at our national disaster management plan. In fact, the Act mandates the ministerial plans, department plans, plans at the lower levels will flow from the national disaster management plan. So that is the first thing which they have to do, sir. Second is now the 15th Finance Commission has recommended for creation of mitigation funds, which was not there earlier, sir. The funding window has a sub-allocation for a mitigation fund at the state level as well as at the national level. So districts will be getting funds, one from state directly, and also they will be able to submit projects at the national level to get funds from the national level also. So they should plan robust mitigation projects. In fact, their district disaster management plan should contain the mitigation projects they can undertake based on the asset risk vulnerability assessment which they have made. And they can submit projects and they can get funds they should implement. So this is my advice. Otherwise, all our collectors are doing good work in terms of response, but this is the area which they should focus now.
I have the same question for Shri Pradhan. How do you see the district level police forces responding to a crisis? Are you getting adequate support from the district level police teams, or is it the NDRF being a solo force in these occasions?
I think that's a very perceptive question and very relevant, because I would not say that we do not get the cooperation from the district police or even the district administration. But let us also just go back quickly to the realization that the district magistrate is supposed to be the incident commander in the case of a disaster that has unfolded in his district, his or her district. And second, that the district police superintendent is also the virtual vice captain or the deputy commander of that incident, and they have to together handle it. Now, the point is that any agency that is emergency oriented has to dovetail into the work. Probably even if NDRF is there or is not there, they have to start working vis-a-vis the disaster response. And it probably will require the local police, the local civil defense, the local home guards, or if there are paramilitary, state paramilitary forces, or even the central paramilitary forces who are deputed for other reasons, maybe insurgency or counter-terrorism, or maybe for anti-Naxal operations. So I have seen that willy-nilly they do come, maybe later, maybe sooner or later. But what would be ideal would be if you have a state disaster response force, make a mock drill as a part of the routine, administrative steps that you take. You don't have to do it every month, but do it every 3 months, do it every 6 months. At least have a mock drill so that you have gone through that gamut of the steps to be taken in the case of a cyclone, if it's a coastal district, if it's a drought, or if it's any crisis that you anticipate in your district. You have a risk profile, so you can plan that. But what we don't do is we think that disaster response and disaster management is not part of our mainstream work as a district collector or an SP. And that is where we make a great mistake. And that is when we get found out. And states and districts have learned it at their peril and with a bad experience, that this is a wake-up thing that has to be handled in normal times. When you're prepared in normal times, when you have done your mock drills in normal times, you are prepared. So my offer is this. NDRF is willing to co-host, assist, handhold any mock drill that you want to do. We have already laid out a plan of action, which is already in the public domain. You can leverage that. or you can do it separately. If we can, we'll certainly help, because that is our in our interest also. So my suggestion is that prepare when the disasters are still not around the corner or still not happened. That is when you will get the best embedding of the culture of preparedness, and that will reorient your forces, whether police or SDRF or home guards or even your civil administration, towards disaster.
Thank you very much for the responses. And I now realize why the Administrative Reforms Commission had placed so much emphasis in putting together a volume of this size in only on disaster management. It's one of the thickest reports that they had given, and recommended strengthening of NDMA and strengthening of NDRF. We look forward to having the NDRF as an international force of assistance in the coming years. Let me thank both of you, and I'll invite Professor Poonam to kindly give the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for today's auspicious session. It was wonderful, excellent learning for us. And I would like to thank the both of lead speakers, Dr. V. Thiruppugazh, Additional Secretary, and Mr. S.N. Pradhan, who has given an excellent speech and excellent experience they have shared with us. And so we are very, very thankful to both of you, sir. And now I would like to thank all the district collectors from the aspirational districts, the professors and the academicians from the repute institutes and the universities, all the senior officers from the DRPGs and DRPG and the NDRF, and all the officers from the concerned department, and my colleagues from National Center for Good Governance. It was very, very learning approach today. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you. Have a nice day. And my chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.